Hi guys, today we're going to talk about how humans impact the different cycles we've been talking about. So this is going to be your last lecture for Unit 2. It should help to wrap everything up. So let's start off by talking about some human impacts that can affect many different cycles. The first of these is the aerosol effect, and you saw this with your volcanoes classwork. It's when you get these atmospheric aerosols, which are tiny particles or particulates that are suspended in the air in the troposphere from these different sources. And because you have these little particles, they can do one of two things. If they are light aerosols, like sulfates, they can actually scatter the light and cool the planet down. If they are darker ones, sootier aerosols, like what usually comes from fires and volcanoes, they can actually warm the planet up because they're going to absorb energy. So I want you to pause for a second here and write down some of the effects. This again would either be a non-polluted cloud, or this could be the effect of those lighter aerosols, and then this would be the effect of the darker aerosols. And look back at your volcano work if you need to for that. Another effect on many of the cycles is smog. So smog literally stands for smoky fog, and there are two types, industrial and photochemical. Industrial comes from power plants and things like that where they're burning coal on an industrial level, and they're giving off things like sulfur oxides and different particulate matter. This has gotten a lot better since 1970 with the Clean Air Act, so this is not such a problem in the US anymore. What is a problem is photochemical smog. That's this brownish orange haze that forms over cities, and it's mostly formed from car exhaust, giving off nitrogen oxides and hydrocarbons. And when we give that off with our cars, that starts to react with oxygen in the sunlight, and that produces ozone at the ground level. And this ozone is a problem. It starts to gather, especially if that city is up against a mountain. The winds are able to kind of push things over the mountain, but it doesn't push the ozone up because the ozone is heavy and it sinks. So all of this smog kind of settles in the valleys. And you've seen that with LA, you've seen that with places in China where you get this cloud of smog that you can't see through. And while we like ozone up in the stratosphere because it helps filter out those UV rays, it is not good down at ground level. And if you pause here for a second, you can write down the health effects of that ozone at ground level. So it's really harmful, especially to anybody who has any kind of respiratory problems in the first place. And because of that, sometimes you will see these ozone alert days or air quality days. Alert days where they tell you not to go outside, especially if you have any sort of respiratory condition, because this ozone will hurt you. Another thing we should talk about going forward is a limiting factor. So limiting factors are either resources or conditions that are going to limit how much something can happen. So how much an organism can grow or develop, how much a population can grow, or in a lot of these cases with our cycles, how much a process can happen. So one of the ways we're going to talk about limiting factors is these are things that impact plant growth and that limit how much plants can grow. And remember, the whole food chain is depending on those plants. So it's really impacting how much of a food chain you can support. So some of the things that limit plant growth is water, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These are major nutrients that they need. We don't usually talk about water because there is usually enough water for plants to survive, but that may become a bigger issue if that becomes a problem. But what we do talk about a lot is the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium around for those plants to survive. And that's why you actually see these numbers on a fertilizer package, because these are the limiting factors for plant growth. So plants need plenty of these things to survive. And this is going to come into play when we talk about eutrophication, because if there's too many of any of these things, it can cause plant growth or algae growth most of the time with eutrophication to grow out of control. Another thing that affects multiple cycles is acid deposition, which you probably know better as acid rain. So this would be majorly an effect on the hydrologic cycle, but it involves a couple other ones as well. So in that hydrologic cycle, when you have different gases that are given off by either power plants, industrial sources, or car exhaust, these gases go up into the clouds and they can start to react with water and acidify it. So when you combine water and CO2, you get carbonic acid, sorry. When you combine water and sulfur oxides, you get sulfuric acid, and nitric oxides will give you nitric acid. And all of these things are going to lower the pH. And remember, the lower the pH is, the more acidic it is, the closer to 0 it is. So there's a number of negative effects of this. A lot of organisms can only live within a certain pH range, so this is going to cause them to get sick and maybe even die. This does increase the weathering of rock into sediment, so you're going to break down a lot of the geologic formations. And it can also influence chemical reactions. It might speed some up, it might slow some down. So here's an overview of the process. Dry deposition happens when these molecules go directly down to Earth, and then at that point they would combine with water and form an acid. More often we get wet deposition, which is when these molecules combine with water up in the clouds, and then you get acid rain. And I want to point out real quick, the orangey red areas here are the areas most affected by acid rain, and we're right in the middle of that. But the purple areas are actually areas that are producing a lot of those pollutants, but not affected themselves. And that can happen because of the prevailing winds, which are taking away those pollutants and then actually spreading them out later over other areas. If you look in Maryland, you can see that luckily most of our rain is not acid rain, that is the green dots, but we do have a lot of yellow dots in there that represent acid rain. And then some of our water is also affected by acid mine drainage, which we'll talk about later in the year. One of the things that can happen with acid precipitation is it's not always acid rain. Sometimes it's acid snow. And if that happens, then these pollutants will start to accumulate in the snowpack up high in the mountains. And what can happen in the spring is as that snow melts, now you get a rush of concentrated pollutants. And it all hits the ponds at the same time. And it can cause what we call an acid shock or an acid pulse, which can literally wipe out entire aquatic ecosystems. Alright, so we'll come back to those as we talk about the different cycles. Those are things that affect multiple cycles. So now let's get into the individual cycles. So if we look at the sulfur cycle, one of the major impacts here is that acid rain from the sulfuric acid that's forming in the clouds. And we're adding those sulfur oxides, especially sulfur dioxide, to the atmosphere by burning coal. That's our #1 cause of acid rain. Burning any other fossil fuels such as oil, refining fossil fuels like petroleum, and also by converting metallic ores into their metals as we're trying to harvest things like copper, lead, and zinc. So the effects of all of these things include acid rain, smog, and that aerosol effect that we talked about at the beginning. So these are impacts on the sulfur cycle. On the water cycle, we're affecting it by withdrawing or rerouting large amounts of fresh water, either for irrigation purposes or for flood prevention, but basically altering the way that water would flow on its own. Clearing vegetation, which is going to cause soil erosion, and that makes the water cloudier so that not all life forms can exist in it if they need sunlight. It removes the natural filtering processes that help to keep our water clean, and it removes the shade, which changes the temperature of the water. We also affect it by polluting our surface and underground water. That's probably the most obvious effect, and by contributing to climate change, because as we discussed before, that's going to change your weather and climate patterns. That also causes ocean acidification, which we'll talk about later in the year, and it makes acid rain even worse. Alright, now if we look at the nitrogen cycle and the ways we have impacts on that, this is going to focus mostly around fertilizers and our use of that fertilizer. So fertilizer production and also burning those fossil fuels are going to release those nitrogen oxides that we talked about, contribute to acid rain and also to smog and the aerosol effect. And fertilizers are also going to introduce nitrates into the system. That's going to cause eutrophication, which we've already talked about. They also introduce nitrous oxide, which acts as a greenhouse gas and also kind of attacks the stratospheric ozone layer. So it's going to reduce the UV radiation that's being filtered so that more of it is getting down to us. they also release nitrogen into the troposphere when we burn forests, particularly burning forests for deforestation, or when we drain or remove wetlands. That releases a lot of nitrogen as well. And nitrous and nitric oxides are major components in car exhaust, major components of that smog and forming that ground level ozone. So actually at this point, we are putting out more nitrogen through fertilizers and through planting legumes, monocultures of legumes, things like beans, peanuts, and these things naturally fix nitrogen, but we are planting unnatural amounts of them. So when we put all this together, we're putting out more nitrogen into the system than all the natural sources combined, and this really throws off the balance. And one of the problems that goes along with this is called nitrogen saturation. Basically, plants can only use so much nitrogen. It is a limiting factor for them, but we give them too much. And when that happens, you get a series of steps. First, ammonium builds up in the soil, and the bacteria in the soil that are doing nitrification convert this to nitrate. And as they do that, they release these H+ ions, which is what makes something acidic, the presence of these H+ ions. So this makes the soil acidic. And this also breaks down any buffers that were in the soil that kept it from being too acidic. So we get a very acidic soil. This increased nitrate level also causes more nitrous oxide to be emitted and leaches nitrate into the groundwater. And then these nitrates in the soil and in the groundwater attract alkaline minerals like calcium, magnesium, and potassium that the plants actually need and keep them from getting to the plants. This further acidifies the soil, and it also removes the essential nutrients that the plants need. So they develop nutrient imbalances, they can't photosynthesize as much. This leads to stunted growth and possible death. So if you pause here for a second, this kind of shows you the overall effects of this nitrogen saturation, which is also kind of effect of this acid deposition. Now, another problem is these nitrates can get into our drinking water, and this can cause a human health problem. So this particular human health problem is known as sad blueberry disease because it literally turns you bright blue, like the girl in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. This happens mostly in infants, but you can pause here for a second and write down the different effects of this. Essentially, what's happening is your blood cells are no longer able to carry oxygen. So it results in this anemic condition. Your cells can't get enough oxygen. That means they can't produce enough energy from your food, and it winds up eventually, if it's bad enough, killing you. And then the last cycle I want to talk about us having effect on is the phosphate cycle. So if we look here at our phosphate cycle for a second, the biggest way that we affect this phosphate cycle is by removing phosphate from the rock in order to make fertilizer. And when we make this fertilizer, we're now adding excess phosphates to the soil, which winds up getting to aquatic systems again in the runoff. We also wind up having extra phosphates coming from animal wastes as well as from the fertilizer, and this can cause that eutrophication cycle as well. So either nitrogen or phosphorus, you get too much of them, and the plant growth basically goes out of control. And like we talked about in class, if it's something like algae in an aquatic system, that plant growth can go out of control to the point that it will block sunlight. And then when that algae dies, it decays and it uses up all the oxygen in the water, and then you get a hypoxic zone, an area where there's no oxygen and nothing can survive. Another way that we impact the phosphorus in the cycle is we will take it out by clearing forests, especially in tropical areas. When we do that deforestation, that removes the natural phosphorus that should be cycling through there. Alright, so I want you to try to pull this all together with what you've talked about cycles so far in your projects. Next class, we'll start to wrap that all up and see how it fits together, and then you can expect your test next Monday. I will see you tomorrow in class. Thanks, bye.